and welcome back to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. Thank you so much for joining me. I release deep dive crime content on a Wednesday and a Sunday, so if you like crime and consistency, I am definitely your channel. Also, just to say, my membership is now out, so on my membership you can get lots of little extra perks. Also, there's a Discord group, and I'll be doing a live there once a month. Aside from that, I've got my Patreon, and my Patreon's got a lot of different podcasts on there, and I'm going to be doing more, including bringing in my family to do some of them because I want it to make like a Kenny family thing. And on top of that, there's going to be a live there as well. So I'm expanding what I'm doing online because I love it and I love you guys. It's as simple as that. So if you want to get involved, go onto my memberships or my Patreon, and hopefully you will find lots of extra content on such areas. The case that I'm going to talk about today is one that when I was researching, I genuinely thought, how did this happen? Genuinely, that was the feeling, just a clear, how on earth did this happen? How are we in a situation in this day and age where these kind of things are playing out? And recently, I have felt more and more that there is so much more that we need to do to ensure that the most vulnerable in our society are protected. The case that I'm going to cover today is involving a young girl with Down syndrome, and it's a very torturous story to follow, but nonetheless I think it highlights yet again some really important issues. So if you can stay with me for this, I really would appreciate it, because I think there is so much to discuss, and also just to create legacy for this girl, because I genuinely feel we live in an ableist society, and whether we like to acknowledge that or otherwise is something that we should try to do, because of the fact that whilst it makes us uncomfortable, that able-bodied people have an easier time, and very often when able-bodied people are vulnerable, things get recognised. Not in all cases, I've covered many cases where that isn't so, but nonetheless, this experience of researching, and also my experience of working in other areas where vulnerable people have found themselves either as victims of crime or actually dealt with in a system where the kind of situations and circumstances they were living in were accepted, even though they were definitely substandard, means that I feel really close to this kind of experience that is talked about in this particular case that I'm going to talk about today. So Debbie Leitch was born in 1995. She was born to parents Elaine Clarke and Thomas Leitch, and Debbie had Down syndrome, and she also had some associated medical problems, so she needed full-time care, and she was, to be honest, completely dependent on her parents. Now, as well as some very distinctive physical characteristics and health problems that are associated with the condition, most children who are born with Down syndrome also experience mild to moderate cognitive impairment, so their language can be delayed, and both their short and long-term memory is affected. But in spite of the fact that there were certain limitations developmentally that Debbie experienced, she didn't let any of it impact on her life. She lived it to the full. And her father, Thomas, said that the thing about his daughter was that she just loved playing and being the centre of attention, which we'd expect for happy children. They love being able to soak up the interests that others place on them. It's as simple as that. Her cousin described her as a really innocent but happy and loving girl, and her wider family said that she was an absolutely wonderful girl. She was always happy, she was always very friendly. Now, they are all descriptions that her family said about her. I'm not making them up. They are literally direct quotes regarding how she came across as a child and young person. She was very much loved. Her support worker, well, she described her as quite shy around people that she didn't know, but then when she got to know people, she was very outgoing. She was also cheeky. I love the word cheeky. It kind of, when it's to do with children, makes you just think about those cute and also engaging children who just like, shall we say, pulling your tail and making sure that you giggle and laugh at them. She also had really long hair, and it was something that she really liked about herself. She enjoyed brushing it, and she had a penchant, shall we say, for horses, as I did when I was a child. She loved horses, and again, gives us a little bit of an insight to her character, doesn't it? Clearly an animal lover. Now, Clarke, her mother, who was originally from Hastings, East Sussex. She actually had 3 other children. And I will be honest, it was a challenging household to some degree because of the complex needs that existed there. So Clarke had other children who actually had physical or learning difficulties. So with respect, I imagine that the stress levels would have been pretty big. I don't think that anybody who has to care for multiple children who have needs is going to find it plain sailing. That isn't to in any way, shape or form suggest that people who are bringing up children with even complex needs do not feel absolute joy and pride in doing so. But nonetheless, it would be remiss of me to not acknowledge that anything that is extra is going to cause a little bit of extra stress at times. Now, Thomas and Clarke split when Debbie was just 5 years of age. And it's at this point a decision was made that Debbie would go and live with her mother. That decision was made by social services. So this meant that Clarke registered as a carer, and that also meant that she received benefits for looking after her. That's a good thing, absolutely. People who have extra needs should certainly, in any decent developed society, be given remuneration to make sure that their life is acceptable. But at the other side of that, sometimes carers may not necessarily feel, shall we say, as willing to do the job and work that they should be doing for the money that they're given. And again, I know the money that carers are given are not levels that would be life-changing at all. I'm just saying that sometimes for some carers, they're not necessarily using the money as they should be doing. That's all I'm putting out there. Now, the standard of care that Clarke did provide her daughter had a hell of a lot to be desired. It really did. At the end of the day, there was so much left out in the care that it feels that Debbie wasn't getting any standard that she deserved. And what's really heartbreaking about this is, in spite of the fact that there was this substandard care, Debbie absolutely idolised her mother. She genuinely did. Her mother was the centre of her world. And for any of us who are from the outside looking in at any kind of situation, one of the most heartbreaking things is when we come across cases where a child is being significantly neglected or abused, and yet that child still has an absolute loyalty to their caregiver, because with respect, we all want our primary caregivers to love us more than anything. And we often believe, no matter how old we are, because young children are like this too, as well as teenagers and adults, we have this belief that maybe if we can just shift and change who we are a little bit, then maybe we can change the way that we're treated. And even though it's an illusion, because we're not the problem, the consequences for that child can be devastating, because they're desperate to get the affirmation that they desire. And that's for children who are, shall we say, typical and able-bodied. The child that we're talking about right now, as she's growing up, she's desperate for her mum to love her, and she has some complex needs, which makes her even more vulnerable and even more deserving of being acknowledged and treated with respect because of that. Now, social services, absolutely, pretty much from the get-go, were aware of Clarke's below par, totally substandard parenting. Every single one of her children was on the child protection register when they were younger. So they had basically been identified at being at significant risk of harm. So for those of you who don't know what the child protection register is, it's basically a register that records young people and children who may be at risk because their families and caregivers are not providing them with an environment or even with sustenance or with the care that is seen at the level that would allow children to remain safe. I'm not even saying that the level has to be that they're thriving, just that they're not at risk of that significant harm. And children can go through their childhood still on it. So it can be something that means that they have case conferences periodically to check, and they can keep that child at home but still on the child protection register. Some will come off it. But nonetheless, when you have a number of children on that register from one family, we are being introduced to there being some big problems at home. Thomas actually said that once the relationship broke down with Clarke, he found it really difficult to spend any time with his daughter. She made it nearly impossible for him to actually see her. So again, we're being introduced to a parent who's incredibly controlling, because ironically, you would think that any parent who wants to remain in a child's life is going to be a welcome one. They're going to be able to reduce stress. They're going to give you some time off. They're going to be a positive role model for your kids. Why would you not want that? And if you're trying to stop that growing and occurring, then it's one of two reasons, isn't it? You're either really bitter and you're punishing your ex, or you don't want them to have insight into what's going on in your home. As Debbie got older, and bear in mind, this is a girl with Down syndrome who actually lives life to the full and is able to express herself in spite of the fact that she has certain developmental issues. When she starts getting older, she's very capable of expressing the fact that she doesn't want to be with her mother. She wants to move in with her father. Social services blocked the move. It's really concerning to me that a young person is starting to try to express their needs and get ignored. It's not as if she had a father who is in any way abusive. She was at a point in time where she was able to express that that was her choice. The fact that she doesn't want to be with mum doesn't mean that she doesn't love her mother. She really did. She was devoted to her in many ways, but she clearly had a preference for her dad. Why did social services block the move? Surely it should have been her needs that are paramount. That's what safeguarding says, that the needs and wishes of the child are paramount. And here we are in a situation where she is perfectly able to elect to go and be with her dad, and social services say no. And bear that in mind, because this story would end very, very differently if I was talking about, at this point, her going and living full-time with her father. If it's not bad enough that Thomas isn't getting time with his daughter, Clarke then moves her children in 2014 to Leeds. So obviously she's had the family breakdown, she's been on the child protection register, she's had the dysfunction as regards the relationship with her dad because mum's been blocking it, and now she's moved to Leeds, which again is further change. But it does feel that when she moves to Leeds, it's really positive. She has a really full life, she's active, she attends a daycare centre, she gets involved in a whole range of activities. She even goes to college, she has lots of friends, and she has a boyfriend. So that picture is what played out when she moved to Leeds. She was happy, she was content, she was thriving. And this was clearly a place where all the pieces of the jigsaw fitted into place for this young girl. And clearly she would be in a point in time where things felt really good. And if only it had stayed that way. Because all of this changes when Clarke moves with Debbie and her siblings to Blackpool in 2016. Now, despite the fact that Clarke was receiving enhanced benefits for Debbie and a £215 a week carer's allowance, it seems like the standard of care that she was providing her daughter just began to descend drastically into something that represented something incredibly neglectful. She began to completely neglect Debbie, and I'm going to be really honest, personally, when I look at what plays out that I'm going to talk to you about today, I do not feel that she had a shred of love or respect or even mild compassion for her child. Her niece would actually later state that Debbie was rarely taken out by Clarke and her then boyfriend, Robert Bruce. It's interesting, isn't it, when new men come on the scene, how attention and money can often, shall we say, get deflected from where it needs to go and instead be spent on the new couple. So at this point, Debbie would be left at home. She was never really given anything, and if she was given anything, it was an afterthought. She had no clothes that were her own personally. She had to wear her mother's. And if I were to sum up the way that Clarke was around her, she was a very lazy, egocentric and selfish mother. She didn't care for her daughter's needs. The only needs that she was concerned about were her own and probably her partner's. She would buy herself new shoes, new bags, and that would be with the benefit money that she was supposed to be spending on caring for her children, which is reprehensible. And even though I appreciate that children don't need lots and lots of presents and gifts and clothes to feel loved, there is a certain element of that that's required. Children do need to feel that sense of physical nurture as well as emotional nurture. And just to put it out there, when I'm talking about the kind of neglect level of Clarke, she would often just not get out of bed to even look after them, to cater for them in any way. She would just look after her own needs. She was a complete waste of space as a parent. She, in spite of being this absolutely lazy, neglectful woman, still decided that when she was offered help, she'd just refuse it. So lots of family members tried to engage with her and say, look, how can we help you out? But as far as she was concerned, she knew better. And one of the things that I probably found most distasteful about this woman, and ironic, is that on her Facebook page, she describes herself as this: I'm very friendly, honest, true person, will help out anyone, the most loyal and trustworthy. Always really worries me when somebody on like a profile of any type decides that they're going to write things like, I'm very friendly, honest, true person, will help anyone, the most loyal and trustworthy. Methinks the lady doth protest too much. You do. You're making it up, aren't you? You're so aware that you're not really that honest and you're not really that loyal that you're going to put it in your profile and hope that somebody's like, the kind of person I'm looking for is the kind of person that would feel the need to express in a profile header that they were indeed trustworthy, honest and loyal, as opposed to the average person who just kind of takes that for granted when you're getting to know people. You're not sitting there going, before I can engage with you, have a conversation, even think about any kind of friendship, I want you to create your own mission statement. I want it to be under a minute, and I want you to make sure you're clear about those personality traits that really matter to me. That's what I want you to do. Off you go. It's just not what people do, is it? So clearly, she's trying to portray a particular person and personality that we may, as this story goes on, feel isn't quite befitting for Clarke at all. And in spite of everything that I'm going to tell you and everything I've told you regarding how difficult Debbie's life starts to become, she loved her mother right until the end, unconditionally. That girl was pure love, and Clarke exploited that, literally exploited her gorgeous Down syndrome daughter, who should have had a life that continued to be thriving as it was back in Leeds. By April 2018, the signs of neglect, they were huge. So Debbie's GP sees her and notes that there's a really serious skin condition that developed and diagnosed her with Norwegian scabies. Now, you're probably not common with Norwegian scabies because in most developing countries now, it's not something that we would expect to see. It's a really nasty form of crusted scabies, which is an infestation that's characterized by these really thick crusts of skin, and they contain really large numbers of scabies, mites and eggs. So to put this in context, Norwegian scabies sufferers are often infected with over 1 million mites from this form of scabies. Now, put that in comparison to regular scabies, where the sufferers who actually are suffering from it are typically infected with around 10 to 20 mites. So that's 1 million mites compared to 10 to 20 mites. So this condition, when you see it in a developed country, it is an absolute telltale sign of neglect, full stop. And actually this is aggravated because people who have Down syndrome are actually at risk of such skin conditions anyway. So this is why you have to be extra vigilant when any kind of things rise up. So the GP, who's understandably recognised this, refers her to the hospital, and she actually had to spend time in hospital for the treatment because it was that serious. You would imagine that Clarke would be absolutely horrified because it's infectious for a start. So you're going to want to make sure if there's other children around that they aren't going to be infected by scabies either. Secondly, you have a child with some more complex needs than is typical. That means that her health has to take priority. You need to be extra careful. And you would definitely think that this would lead to her going to follow-up appointments because it's essential. But she doesn't. She doesn't take her to go to the hospital for a follow-up appointment to make sure it's under control. Now, subsequently and rightfully, the hospital then go and make a safeguarding referral to adult social services, which is absolutely the correct course of action. Nothing happens. Yeah. Absolutely nothing happens as a result of that referral. This is despite of the fact that Blackpool Council Social Services were actually visiting Clarke at the time on a daily basis to see her son. So they have this safeguarding referral for this vulnerable young person, young adult, and as opposed to them thinking, well, we can at least check in because we're going regularly, even if it's a different department dealing with it, it's just neglected. Think about that skin condition just for a moment. Think about a condition characterised by 1 million mites on your body. How that would feel. How debilitating that would be. How painful that would be. And then imagine that the one person who is there to protect you, to keep you safe, to protect you from all of those conditions that can cause us problems in our lives, is the person who's just allowing it to fester. And fester is a really appropriate word for this kind of condition. The apathy that Clarke had regarding her parenting responsibilities per se was horrific, and again was highlighted in May 2018. Now this is in what I would consider a very uncharacteristically proactive mood. She actually goes ahead and requests an assessment, and this assessment is so that Debbie can access activities like she had done in Leeds, so we could take a breath and go, wow, actually she's getting her stuff together now, she's getting her act together, she's recognising that Debbie needs some kind of opportunity in the local community. But then after asking for this, she just fails to attend any of the meetings. So she actively goes and says, is it possible to get an assessment? They're like, yeah, and then nothing actually plays out. So accordingly, the way this is dealt with is the Adult Community Learning Disability team just closes its file. By autumn 2018, we see that social services are again involved with Clarke's family. Now this time, it's in relation to her daughter and her grandson. So there's obviously a lot of family dynamic issues going on here. There's a lot of dysfunction in the home. When they visit Clarke's place, they're absolutely stunned because it is squalid. Genuinely. The conditions there are dire. The place is really filthy, and that in itself is massive warning bells. When I worked in safeguarding and used to visit homes, filthy homes were a massive red flag, because if you can't clean your home, you're not doing a good job protecting your children, full stop. If you haven't got a priority of making sure the environment is safe, you're not going to have a priority of making them safe per se. So that's really worrying, particularly when you have children with complex needs, and when they refer to it as having squalid conditions, well, that's all I need to know. This needs to have constant monitoring, because those kids are all at risk. Even though they're young adults, there are no grandchildren there now, which is a real problem. So the place is filthy, and they then decide that they need to try to do another assessment on Debbie so that she can access activities. Again, Clarke just fails to keep any appointments. She doesn't reply to anybody getting in touch with her, and when people contact her, she just avoids that fully. So what do? They just close the file again. Now, this is really bizarre. This is a vulnerable person, and they are suffering the consequences of their ineffectual carer. Shouldn't repeated failures to keep appointments warrant an escalation of some kind rather than just a closure of the file? Surely alarm bells should have been ringing for social services. And also, what are you hearing about in this case? You're hearing about a complete bypass of the desires of the person that should be involved at the centre of this, which is Debbie. Actually, what does she want? Why is nobody speaking to her? Why is nobody having a conversation with this young woman? She had attended college, had a boyfriend, been involved with lots of activities. This is not somebody who cannot let you know what she would like to happen, and yet everybody just ignores her. Let's just speak to the carer who can't even keep the home clean and does absolutely nothing to progress the daughter's life in any way, shape or form. Well, that's apparently acceptable. Apparently. So early 2019, family members actually visit Clarke's home. And like I said at the very beginning, when I told you about the position that the family have on who Debbie was, it's clearly one that was very, very special, and they cared deeply for her. So when they go around, they were absolutely horrified by Debbie's condition. One, she's visibly deteriorated before their eyes. They said that prior to them seeing her that time, she'd always been a little bit plumper, a little bit overweight, but now she was really, really thin. And that skin condition that she'd been treated in hospital for, that was obviously profoundly upsetting and painful, was back, but with a vengeance. And it was affecting her in a way where her gorgeous long hair, which she just loved to brush, was now really short and scraggy. And if you think about when you're very unwell, often hair does begin to fall out. Add to that the fact that she had this horrible rash that was also additionalizing the hair loss as it has spread to her scalp. This is all just screamingly obvious neglect, isn't it? And obviously the family members instantly confront Clarke about it. This isn't as if they didn't ask her or challenge her. And they say, what on earth has gone on? This place that you're living in is a squalid home. Why is this young woman starting to look so diabolically unwell? But she's just highly dismissive. And I think on reflection, on that day, the family wished that they had immediately called the police and social services, because at this point it would have been far better for Debbie to have been removed from that environment, full stop. Probably all of the people living in that house to be removed, full stop. In April 2019, Clarke's sister and family members visit again. Now, at this point, Debbie stays in her room, and Clarke says that she wants her to be left alone, but Clarke's niece doesn't want to do that. So she goes in to see her, and she is blindsided by what she sees. So Debbie's condition, that was already in dire straits, shall we say, in the previous visit, had significantly deteriorated. Her room as well was absolutely filthy. And apparently the smell was utterly horrific. Debbie was curled up in the bed in the dark. So I want you to just imagine that girl that I'm talking about earlier on, thriving in life, going to college, having a boyfriend, just enjoying everything about being alive. And now she's lay curled upon a bed in the dark. She was wearing pajamas that were so heavily soiled, they looked like they were rotting. The family at this point persuade her to actually come out of her room, because I imagine they want to see further how she is, can she walk, what's happening there. And she actually does. but they said that she was struggling to walk. Again, what they're seeing here is clear signs of neglect. So she's got lots of muscle wastage, which makes it very, very difficult for her to walk. Heartbreakingly, and God, so undeservingly for Clarke, she's actually calling for her mum. She's crying for her mum. That really offends my sensibilities. The idea that this lovely young woman, in a scenario of anguish, pain, disablement because of the starvation at this point, the muscle wastage, she still wants her mum. And that you think of all those women out there who never get to have somebody call them mum. And here we have somebody who is abusing that position so gravely. Now, Clarke's sister is absolutely horrified, really horrified by what she sees. And she gives her an ultimatum. She says she's got 2 weeks to sort out the problem or she's going to go to the authorities. I know what a lot of you will be thinking. You'll be thinking that Clarke's sister should have not given her an ultimatum. They should have accepted that there was something tragically, treacherously befalling this young person, and they should have gone over Clarke's head and just done it. But again, the thing about family dynamics is it's unbelievable how we can be convinced of what we want to believe. And if Clarke was absolutely clearly stating, I promise you this is all going to change, people often will give those that they love the benefit of the doubt. And I think when we talk about these cases, it's a reminder for anyone out there, don't give them the benefit of the doubt. You know what I say all the time, take a risk, offend them. Yeah, it will probably cause an argument if you're related to somebody. They'll call you a busybody, they'll say you're interfering, but my God, that's okay. As long as you're interfering in the best interest of a young person or a child, then you are a hero, whether it turns out that you were absolutely 100% right or that you were wrong. You can always work on a relationship with a family member, but you can't do anything about a dead human being. So always risk offending. Clarke's sister then actually does speak to her over the next few weeks because she's checking in. She wants to make sure that something has changed. And actually Clarke is saying, you know what? Of course, it's all been sorted. Absolutely got my stuff together here. Everything's absolutely as it should be. Debbie's up, she's about, she's clean, she's showered, she's eating really well. Clarke's sister takes her at her word. And again, you want to say, well, maybe she could have gone and checked on her. Maybe she couldn't have trusted what she'd actually heard because of what she'd seen being so diabolical. But it seems that Clarke's a good manipulator and she is convincing. And she is convincing enough all the way through to some degree for people to, shall we say, ignore the obvious. Because all of this is absolute lies. Nothing's changed at all. The truth is, things are getting worse, a lot worse for Debbie. So by June 2019, Clarke finally gets hold of some cream and some antibiotics to treat Debbie's incredibly severe scabies. And by the end of June, she actually advises the GP that it seems to be doing the trick. I don't think that for a minute. I think that she was just trying to pull the wool over the GP's eyes, seeming that she was doing the right thing. And realistically, the scabies would have been completely out of control by this point. So likelihood is that she's just lying. And by this point, Debbie is seriously unwell. Her health has deteriorated even further. So 26th of July 2019, bizarrely, Clarke holds a celebration for her son who's at home. So it's a birthday celebration. At this point, she tells her family members that Debbie's in a room. She doesn't want anyone to see her, as in Debbie is electing to see nobody apparently. Clearly out of character as well. Debbie's personality was gregarious and lovely. Yes, shy around strangers, but very much engaged with family that she would have known and loved. So for her to want to be in her room was not typical behaviour. However, understandably, the family are concerned about this. They've been there before. They had their suspicions then, and they discovered that Debbie was very, very unwell. So in spite of the fact that they're told, don't go in there, she doesn't want to see anybody, they do go in. And they are absolutely horrified at this point. In fact, they describe the smell in that bedroom as being almost unbearable. The room's just full of takeaway boxes, rotting food, dirty adult diapers. And again, they look and Debbie is just curled up on her bed. By the way, the bed sheets at this point were just filthy. They were soiled. She'd had all her hair, that hair that she really loved, just virtually chopped off. And also the bit that was there was just falling out because the severe rash had continued to get even worse on her scalp. The scabies was actually worse than ever by this point, and they said that her skin looked like raw flesh. Clarke's niece actually said later, it was like looking at something that was out of a horror movie. This is Debbie we're talking about. And her cousin is literally describing the scene as if it was something out of a horror movie. Debbie was in a really distressed state at this point. And again, what is she doing that is so upsetting? Well, she's calling out for her mum. Just take a moment to imagine that. Your child of any age is distressed, in pain, and the one name that they're calling is mum or dad. They're recognizing that relationship in that moment, and they're singling you out as the individual that can bring some soothing. Come hell or high water, no matter how many people we had to knock down on the way, we would be there, wouldn't we? Because that's the gift that you're given when you bring children into this world. You know that their happiness is inextricably linked towards yours, and if anything were to happen to them, you would exchange every piece of their pain and internalize it immediately if they could just be soothed. That's how we feel. Clarke just ignores her. And this is actually in front of her family. And there's a million things that I can say about this, but the most obvious is it displays how little care she feels for this child. Yes, she's a young adult now, but she's her child, she's her baby, and she's just disinterested. Even when that girl is crying for her in agony, infested with scabies that her mother failed to treat, she doesn't care. She just lets her deal with her pain. Now, Clarke's niece, Sammy Mugridge, she later actually told court, "I'll never forget the last day I saw Debbie alive. I knew she was ill and not well, but the sight of her in the room will live with me forever." Part of me thinks, is it possible that Clarke was just oblivious to her daughter's appalling conditions? Or is it that she genuinely had no care or consideration for her? Is it that she was under some kind of drugs influence? Is there something that was numbing the reality of what was playing out in front of her? I think probably I'm giving her too many excuses there, because I've worked with a lot of drug users, and with respect, they still care for their kids. So probably allowing her a little bit more credit by offering her such a kind of excuse. But either way, the point is that this child is dying before her, and she's letting this happen. And she's letting this happen with an audience at this point. Now that Debbie's auntie and cousin have seen that the situation hasn't improved at all, they realise immediately that Debbie's life is at serious risk. Again, I will have it noted that Clarke, who clearly knows that her sister and niece have, I don't know, eyes and a nose and a brain, therefore can process what they are seeing, tries to act like, no, there's no problem. There's no problem. You literally have a young adult in a bedroom rotting away, infested with mites, and you're okay with that? It's not happening. That's literally the way that she handles this. So the family are absolutely horrified, and they are so worried at this point that they decide that they might call the police. Instead, they make a decision to call social services, which you would imagine was an appropriate course of action because, of course, there is a young adult with complex vulnerabilities and they are genuinely at a point where their life is at risk. Therefore, social services are going to dash over and deal with this situation? Yeah? No. Even though they call social services, all that happens is social services send a safeguarding alert to a GP. Now, this is a doctor from Whitegate Health Centre who makes a home visit the same day. But before the GP visit, Clarke basically attempts to hide all the very clear signs of neglect. So she gives Debbie a shower. Bear in mind, she has this now extreme, raw skin condition. That would have been so painful for her. And apparently she did scream throughout it. Then she changes her out of these very filthy pajamas. She puts her into this oversized hoodie. And this is clearly a way of trying to make out that she isn't emaciated. She's aware that she's very thin. She wants to hide that from the GP. And also she brings her downstairs so she's not in her disgustingly rotten, squalid room. Obviously, I wasn't there when the doctor visited, but I don't think it takes a brain surgeon to imagine that there would have been a horrific aroma. There was a girl literally rotting away in a bedroom that was covered in feces and takeaway food, and the girl had horrific scabies all over her. Of course there would be some kind of horrible aroma, but somehow this GP on call comes to this conclusion. He checks Debbie and he says that her skin was dry and inflamed, but he didn't actually diagnose scabies. And if that isn't bad enough, he decided that there were no safeguarding concerns. No safeguarding concerns. Now just think, Clarke's sister and niece were so concerned when they spoke to social services that they literally thought that Debbie was going to die. How on earth did this doctor believe that there were no safeguarding concerns? Her skin condition was literally horrific and it was just getting worse. She'd lost a ridiculous amount of weight and yet she was not picked up as a person of risk. So now, in spite of what the family had done by telling social services, we're not getting anywhere. And of course, Debbie is in imminent danger. It does seem bizarrely that Clarke was somehow able to fool authorities, to fool health professionals. And she actually had the audacity to tell the doctor that she had no idea what her family were talking about. In fact, she added this: they maybe had mistaken the squalid conditions with the fact that Debbie just needed to have a nappy changed. Like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Sorry, Clarke, just go through that again. So, when your family rang social services and suggested that they felt that your daughter was in a bedroom that was so squalid it looked like she was from a horror movie, you think that they could have mistaken the feces, the takeaway boxes, the scabies, the general rotting away of a human who's alive with a dirty nappy. This is just me. How can a doctor firstly miss that and secondly believe what's being said? I don't have any idea why the doctor didn't just go, you know what, I'm just going to pop up and have a look at the room because clearly you've nothing to hide, and then I can just confirm that this young person is not at risk and I'll go on my way. At which point they would have absolutely been able to legitimately agree with the family's concerns. Debbie was kept in that bedroom all of the time. The fact that she'd been brought down should have been also a red flag, because the family were telling social services this. This was another massive opportunity where Debbie could have been saved, but of course it was just missed. So the doctor then arranges to see her again in 2 weeks, and guess what? When you arrive to follow up the appointment, no one answered the door. No one answered the door. And then Clarke just doesn't go to the GP surgery and doesn't return any calls there. And guess what? No action is taken. I've worked in lots of safeguarding cases with able-bodied children. I have never heard of this systemic failure to engage per se and to bypass the individual who is actually at risk. It's as if Debbie was completely invisible, isn't it? Literally. Even when her family is saying basically she's decaying in a bedroom, no one checks the bedroom, no one follows up when the mother just doesn't answer the door. And this is a child that the family said is an imminent threat. 29th of July 2019. Well, social services call again at Clarke's home. Now, despite being told not to leave Debbie in the care of her other disabled daughter, apparently Clarke isn't at home. Now, her daughter won't let social workers into the property because she'll have been primed not to do so without a doubt. Obviously, she wouldn't let social services in because there are issues in the home. So saying that Clarke isn't there is a way of preventing them getting entry, even though they feel that they want to see what's going on. Arguably could say, well, Clarke was probably there anyway, but she would just tell her daughter to go and say she was out. Either way, we know that the main prerogative there was to prevent entry. The state of the house was dire, remember. So social services then get a call off her later the day to kind of explain away why she wasn't present. And what does she do in that phone call? Oh, she's like, Debbie is doing great. Okay. There was a referral to social services that never got properly followed up. The doctor came, then didn't actually see her again. That didn't get properly followed up. And now you tried to get into the house to see how things are, and well, I've not let you in. But you know what? A phone call telling you everything's fine should just be okay, right? How many red flags are we going to go through today? Social services then call again on the 1st of August. This is 2019 again. And this time Clarke is basically ready for them. So she's cleaned Debbie and she's tidied her room. I cannot imagine for 1 minute it did not stink to high heaven. Anybody who has left a place and allowed it to get covered in shit and takeaway food and all the festering that takes place there, it will take more than a clean and a tidy and some Febreze to make that space smell acceptable. But in spite of the fact that this will have smelled awful and that Debbie is looking really unwell, she's worryingly thin, for some reason, guess what? The social workers aren't concerned. Like, this is so frustrating. Sharing this with you is so frustrating. I mean, I've talked about a lot of cases where social workers haven't even been involved and terrible things have happened, but we are talking about social workers being involved on the daily, and this is not getting picked up. What is this telling you about how disabled people are treated? Because it's telling me a very concerning story. It seems like on this occasion, in spite of how sick this girl looks, despite how thin she looks, they're just completely persuaded by Clarke that everything's fine, and that also Debbie's improving and her skin's being treated. So even though they can physically see this young woman deteriorating, they are completely convinced by the words of this woman. They then have a follow-up meeting arranged for the 2nd of September. However, by this point, whatever temporary care Clarke had given to Debbie to try to make her look at least presentable, well, that had abruptly ceased, shall we say, following that visit. Now, even though obviously there was going to be this follow-up meeting, it didn't mean that they couldn't have actually checked on Debbie in the interim. And the reason for that is they were visiting Clarke's son there on a regular basis, so regularly that they were able to report that during those visits, they could often hear Debbie crying in her room. This child, who is clearly known to social services, who have had family get in contact with them for fear of the way that she's being treated, and they can hear her crying in a room regularly, and they don't just go out of their way and see what's happening, open the door. Oh yeah, they express concern to Clarke, but she's just really dismissive, and she says she's attention seeking, which blows my mind, because let me tell you, if there was a child crying in a bedroom regularly, I'd want to check that out. We're talking about a vulnerable young adult who has Down syndrome. That is not what we would expect to see in this situation. Somebody who was manipulative and crying for attention. That does not make sense. The fact that they do not even make this link, this is a woman with Down syndrome who will be naive and loving and innocent and sweet. And the last thing that she's going to have is some kind of Machiavellian manipulation where she's like, ha ha ha, how can I control my mother? That does not happen. And they should have known that. But even though they have this rap street history of how awful Clarke has really been as a mother to some degree, it doesn't seem to bother them. They're not that concerned about her well-being. It's as simple as that. Now, social workers and health professionals were not the only ones that Clarke was able to fool. Neighbours of hers did hear Debbie crying, mummy, mummy, and they actually expressed concern to Clarke, and all she did was say, well, Debbie's unwell. She's just got an excuse for all of this. But if all these threads could just have been connected, well, I wouldn't be sat here telling this story right now. The final week of August 2019, partner of Clarke's other daughter sees Debbie at the house. And at this point, she is in such a terrible state. I mean, she'd already lost weight, as I've told you, but now she's lost even more weight. And she was described as skin and bone. She was just lying on the floor. And that's likely because she genuinely did not have the strength to move. And again, there's this horrific, pungent stench coming from her room. Between January 2019 and August 2019, it's when the neglect is at its worst. Clarke's boyfriend, Robert Bruce, is also living in the property. Now, it is incredible to me that what I've just explained to you is that Debbie was going through this systematic suffering when there were two adults there to witness it. This is not a young adult who is quietly just decaying. She's letting people know. She's crying. She's calling for mummy. And there are two adults there who are seeing this play out and nothing is happening. And this is during the really extensive, as far as I'm concerned, suffering. On the 29th of August 2019, finally, emergency services receive a call from Clarke. But at this point, they're told that Debbie's been very unwell for some time, and she says that she'd stopped eating and drinking, and then she'd just, gone to check on her. And apparently she was cold and unresponsive. And she tells them that Debbie is dead. The operator repeatedly tells Clarke to go back to the bedroom to try to resuscitate Debbie, but she refuses. I mean, we know why she refuses. It's for an obvious reason. She knows absolutely damn well that there is no way that Debbie is going to be revived, because she knows that she hasn't just died. When those paramedics arrive, it is absolutely harrowing. It's 10:40 p.m. They get to Clarke's house at Garden Terrace, Blackpool, and they are absolutely appalled. The scene that greets them is straight out of a horror movie. First of all, Debbie's room just smells of death. There's feces on a bed on the floor. Debbie is completely emaciated. And I'm talking prisoner of war level emaciated. She's in a horrific physical state. They find her lying on the floor in a really unnatural position, and that's because rigor mortis had long since set in, to be honest. It was later established that Debbie had been dead for between 8 and 36 hours. Let that sink in, 8 and 36 hours. Now, Clarke claimed that her daughter had been dead since 8 p.m. that evening, and she just waited before calling 999. I mean, who in their right mind would leave calling the ambulance when you find your child of any age potentially dead? I mean, you are going to be at that phone or screaming out of a window for help the moment you discover them. But no, she basically admits that she'd waited before she called them. Debbie's body was in such a state that her ribs were literally showing through her skin. The ambulance crew know straight away this is not a natural death, and they call the police. And when the officers arrive, they too cannot believe what they are seeing, because that severe rash I've told you about, it's all over Debbie's scalp, it's across her face, it's on the soles of her feet. And those scabs and scabies were so badly encrusted on her face that the police were not even able, in the first instance, to confirm her gender. Her limbs were just wasted, and also they were covered in this extensive rash. 30% of her body was covered in what was regarded as severely crusted scabies. The jumper and trousers that she was wearing, they were just filthy, and there were mites crawling all over them. When they went beneath her trousers, she was wearing this urine-soiled nappy, and there were live maggots crawling next to her body. When they actually cut away those clothes later on, bits of her skin came away with it, and there were mites found just crawling all over her back. You will not be surprised to know that her skin had ulcerated in lots of places, and the scabies mites had just bred and multiplied. And that, to be honest, indicated how long she'd had the skin infection for, and also how severe that infection had got. The trousers that she was wearing was just full of diarrhea, and her buttocks were just caked in feces that extended all the way down her thighs, because nobody had been looking after her. When they did the post-mortem, they established that that poor young woman weighed just 3 stones, 10 pounds at the time of her death. That's about 1/3 the weight of an average woman her age. Can you imagine that? She had just been systematically and protractedly ignored, just left for a long period of time to just die in this utter agony, being eaten away by a condition that could have been treated, without the sustenance, without the nurture to be able to even fight that kind of situation. Bear in mind, in 2016, that's before she moved to Blackpool, she'd actually weighed over 10 stone. She'd lost over 6 stone. The cause of death was recorded as severe emaciation and neglect with extensive and severe scabies skin infection. You'd think I was talking about a famine-ravaged girl from another country, wouldn't you? That the world had not been able to save, who had been affected by nature and by a lack of provision and services in that country. I'm talking about in the UK, in Blackpool, a seaside town where there are lots of services, a place where you can go to a food bank if you are struggling to eat, a place where you can go to hospital to have your conditions treated, a place where social services are meant to protect you. But I'm talking about this young woman constantly having social services round at the house and yet losing 6 stone in their care, so to speak, under their watch. Debbie's father, poor dad, Thomas, well, do you know how he found out? He found out about his daughter's death, his own daughter's death, through a comment that Clarke posted on Facebook. Yeah. Imagine. She didn't even have the respect to tell the father of the girl that died how she had died, and also that she was indeed dead. He had to find it out from a cold, faceless comment on a social media platform, meaning that he probably found out after others who were completely unrelated to that girl. Thomas set about organising Debbie's funeral. He obviously wanted to make sure that she was given a send-off that she deserved. He wanted to show his love to her. Anyway, it turned out that even though he thought he could get a grant, he wasn't actually entitled to it. And that meant that Clarke had the power. And you know what she did? If it wasn't an insult enough that she allowed that poor young woman who had a whole life ahead of her to decay in that torturous space, she even took away the opportunity for Thomas to be able to give her the send-off that she so dearly and rightfully deserved. And instead, she decided to give her a pauper's funeral. I'm sure that if you cut some people, they just have like stone in their veins. I really do. And I think that Clarke fits this picture entirely. The police were absolutely horrified by this case, and they actually launched Operation Acton. They wanted to investigate Debbie's death. And when interviewed by the investigators, Clarke goes on to just consistently deny that she's had any involvement in the death of her daughter. She gets on with this customary behaviour, just saying that there is actually no problem and that she doesn't know how this had happened. So this lying is constantly this attempt to reduce her responsibility for her daughter's death. She has no accountability in this whatsoever. You would imagine, having been caught bang to rights in a house that clearly tells a story of this young girl's death, that she would just stand and admit it, because there's no escaping it. But no, it's worked for her before. She's been able to just try to wheel away out of things and convince people that there's not a problem, and absolutely manage to deflect social services and doctors' attention. So hey, why not just carry on doing it to the police? But she's met her match this time. In April 2021, Clarke is charged with gross negligence manslaughter. Now, this is a type of involuntary manslaughter, and it means that as there was no intent to kill the victim or to cause some serious harm, it doesn't satisfy the guilty mind that would be required for murder. So instead, it arises where a duty of care was owed to the victim, and that duty of care is breached, and that the breach caused the victim's death. That's in circumstances where there was an obvious risk of death in particular. So finally, the nature of that negligence has to be so gross that it amounts to a criminal offence. Don't get me wrong, guys. I know a lot of you will be like, as far as you're concerned, this is murder. And I have to say, personally, I think starving somebody to death on your watch and literally untreated medical conditions that you've helped to cause and create and sustain, along with not providing any sanitation, certainly feels like there is intent there. But nonetheless, this is what she's charged with. And we can definitely agree that the reason that they say about the fact that she hasn't had a duty of care provided, it definitely stands with that particular charge, because Clarke definitely owed Debbie a duty of care. She was a mother, she was a primary care provider, and she breached it. She breached it in many ways, because she didn't even provide her daughter, who was vulnerable, with even the most basic needs. She didn't feed Debbie, she didn't get her adequate medical attention, and there was absolutely a clear risk of death that had been pointed out to her by her own family. Anyone with half a brain would conclude the negligence was so bad, right? So anyone could then say, well, this is such terrible negligence, it has to be criminal. And indeed, we all agree, without a shadow of a doubt, this was definitely criminal. You won't be surprised, however, to find out that when she was charged with this, she pleaded not guilty to gross negligence manslaughter at Preston Crown Court on the 19th of May 2021. I know, surprising, right? Let's just run through that. So we have charged you with gross negligence manslaughter, which really, I think if you put it out to a vote of 1 million people, we'd all agree should probably just be murder. They should just change the law for you, because certainly it seems like you went out of your way to ensure that poor young person died. But in spite of this, you don't think you're guilty of it. No, I'm not guilty of it. Why? I've just learned that if I say something, in the end, people just believe me. So you're just suggesting that by just denying that you're involved, in the end, the services around them and you will just go, okay, you're not involved. Yeah, it's worked really well up until now. I don't even know where that noise came from, I'm not going to lie. It's mind-blowing that she would not take responsibility at this point, isn't it? And because she doesn't, of course, the case goes to trial. Now, Clarke's former partner, that's 45-year-old Robert Bruce from Leeds, well, he's lived in the house during the height of Debbie's neglect, remember. He's also charged with allowing or causing the death of a vulnerable adult. Charge later gets dropped. I don't know how either. I don't know how either. I mean, I have my suspicions, which I'll talk about later, but wow. Now, just 10 days before Clarke is due to go on trial, she basically changes her plea to guilty. So she goes guilty on the gross negligence manslaughter in December 2021. I am not surprised by that. It will definitely have been because she was banged to rights and she knew that if she did that, she'd get a lesser sentence without doubt. Despite this, despite being like, yeah, okay, I definitely did do that, I am guilty of that, she's like, but I did my best for my daughter. I mean, I did my best for my daughter. You would not condescend to even say that, would you, when you've just gone guilty for this crime and the death of your child, who, by the way, still loved you right up until the end. But that's what she does. She didn't do her best for her daughter. In fact, in the final days of Debbie's life, she did nothing at all. She left her vulnerable daughter, the daughter who was calling mummy, mummy, who was begging for help, to die alone, in agony, in squalor. She did that absolutely willingly. And when you think about murder, well, you know what? Murder tends to be quick. Even serial killers don't tend to draw out a torturous death like that for months and months. It's not how even the worst type of death in our heads plays out. And yet that's what that girl faced, alone. And Clarke let her decay. And yet, she reckons she did her best for her. So following the guilty plea, she gets remanded in custody. And on the 24th of February 2022, 49-year-old Clarke is sentenced by Judge Amanda Yip at Preston Crown Court. The judge said, "You are responsible for Debbie's death. You were her mother. She lived with you. And you were also paid as her carer. You have at times continued to minimise your responsibility. You say you did your best. You may be in denial to yourself as much as to others, but you cannot say that is true. Not only did you not do your best, but you must have done absolutely nothing to care for her. Instead, you simply abandoned her to die alone in pain, without nourishment, in the most awful state. The pain she must have felt is apparent. Debbie was starved. The scabies were allowed to run out of control. She became more and more weakened until she died. In her last days, she was denied the most basic care and dignity. The judge also identified several aggravating factors in this case. I mean, I think we can probably think of several hundred, but okay, let's go for the several that were identified. So the history of abuse through the neglect, because there was this extended period of a long time where she was completely neglected. She'd been neglected for months indeed, and it had gradually escalated. In fact, Clarke had even waited until Debbie had actually been dead for some time before she even contacted emergency services. Also, another aggravating factor is that Debbie had Down syndrome, and that meant that she was particularly vulnerable. She should have been cared for even more diligently because of that. In mitigation, okay, well, the judge did take into account that Clarke hadn't got any previous convictions, although I think we can agree she racked them up in the period that she was literally torturing her child. But okay, she hadn't been caught for anything. Furthermore, she was given, as I suggested, with a reason why she went guilty, a 20% reduction in her sentence for her guilty plea prior to the trial. Basically, because she admitted it, it's like, oh well, you deserve a bit of time off. So ultimately she was sentenced to 9 years and 7 months for gross negligence manslaughter. I know. It does not sound like a long time at all. I completely agree with you. She will have to serve 2/3 of that sentence before she's eligible for parole, but my God, I don't think that serving just over 6 years is ever going to be payment for what she stole from that poor young person and from the life and future that she should have been able to thrive in. All Debbie ever wanted, she wanted love and affection from her mother. Clarke never gave it to her. And Clarke's niece actually stated this at her sentencing. Debbie didn't have a life. It was robbed from her by the one person who should have cared for her, her mother. It's inexplicable to me that when Debbie was alive, Clarke managed to create this illusion. You know, she lied to all the people that could have helped her. Remember that she cleaned Debbie, she cleaned her room when she was being investigated to make it look like she was being cared for. Yet, the moment that Debbie had actually died, she did nothing to hide those squalid conditions. So even though she'd gone out of her way to hide it from the authorities, the moment that actually the authorities are going to get real insight because Debbie's now dead, she does nothing about it. And there's a bit of me that's like, well, is that because she succeeded? Did she actually think that she could get away with it? She didn't want Debbie present in her life, so she just hoped that once she died, she could just have her removed and get on with her life? Or was it that she realised she'd gone too far and there was no point hiding it? I don't think so, because she was trying to go not guilty. Now, the investigating officer stated, "We know Debbie came to Blackpool having been a happy, thriving college student. Sadly, in just a few years, she was let down in the most extreme manner by the dark and malevolent personality that is Elaine Clarke. Clarke has shown no remorse at any stage in this lengthy investigation. Any tears she has shed were for her. The predicament that she now finds herself in is what she's concerned about. She is truly a despicable individual." In January this year, it was announced that Blackpool Social Services will be investigated following Debbie's tragic death. No shit, Sherlock. Really? We don't need an announcement, because it would take a small child to be able to read just a tiny few notes without any knowledge of the world around them to be able to say, something needs to happen here, genuinely. The fact that they're getting investigated is the tiniest shred of hope in this story, because my God, something needs to change. It seems incredible to me that Debbie died when there were literally tons of opportunities to save her. You know, there was clear evidence of neglect earlier on because of the fact they'd been on the child protection register. But even in Blackpool, the year before her death, it was clear that there was neglect. She was seen multiple times by social workers, by healthcare professionals. Even members of the family expressed direct concerns that she was going to die. Remember? And then the doctor came around and was like, nah, she's fine, she's got a bit of a rash. I mean, you cannot get clearer than a family member saying, I think this girl is going to die unless she gets some help. Neighbours heard her crying. Social workers attended regularly at the Clarke's residence because they were seeing her son. They could hear the distress of that poor young woman and they did nothing. Instead, and this is mind-blowing, they took the word of a woman with a track record of wholly inadequate parenting abilities, literally. And we have to wonder, don't we? It's troubling, it's disturbing, it's upsetting, but would things have been different if Debbie hadn't been Down syndrome? Because I think what we're looking at here is an ableist privilege, that if she had been a child without any kind of syndrome or disability or issues, they would have noticed her more. Because our society, whether we want to accept it or otherwise, treats people who are different differently. And it makes them more vulnerable. It's as simple as that. And I think that Debbie paid that price. There was a study done in Texas between the years of 2002 to 2011, and the basis of this study was that they wanted to look at whether there was an increased risk for maltreatment of children with certain disabilities, and this included Down syndrome, and they were looking particularly at the issues that occurred before the age of 2. Now, whilst the actual risk of any maltreatment was, found to be similar between children with Down syndrome and unaffected children, what the study did conclude was that the risk of medical neglect was 3 to 6 times higher. Can you believe that? That whilst the neglect could occur, the abuse could occur in all those children under 2, whether they had Down syndrome or otherwise, whether they had disabilities or otherwise, what was the real problem that additionalized the issues in this abuse was the fact that when they were meant to get help, they were neglected at a 3 to 6 times higher rate. That is scary, really scary, because it means when presented to services that are meant to protect, they were going unnoticed. And that has to come down to the fact that visibility is different for these children. Research has also indicated that individuals with Down syndrome are at high risk of physical and sexual abuse. And meanwhile, there was a 2014 study by the US Department of Justice, and that found that individuals with disabilities encountered violent crime at nearly 3 times the rate of those in the general population. So those with cognitive disabilities such as Down syndrome had the highest rate of violent victimization. 40% of violence against people with disabilities was committed by people well known to them or by casual acquaintances of the victim. Isn't that horrifying? Isn't that just really troubling to actually conceptualize that our most vulnerable are even more vulnerable of these horrible situations befalling them? Clarke wasn't overtly violent towards Debbie, as far as we know, but she was still massively abusive through severe neglect. And I feel that it is a form of violence, particularly when it leads to the starvation of an individual. But it's tragic, having just talked about that research, that it's demonstrated that the risk to people like Debbie is higher, realistically, by the people who are meant to be caring for them. So the very people who are meant to protect them are the ones that cause them harm. And in spite of the fact that this research clearly evidences that, and that professionals should be aware of this evidence, it doesn't take long to read about it and to gen up on the knowledge, as I have. So anybody who's coming into contact with vulnerable populations should know this stuff, because then it means that you're thinking clearly about what could happen behind closed doors, and that you're more tuned into noticing it when it does. But it seems that these issues are again and again played out, that failures occur again and again by the very services that are supposed to protect them. And I know that every single one of you listening will just be going through your mind thinking about all the missed opportunities that occurred when social services were literally in that home on a regular basis. The case of poor Debbie today highlights the continued and urgent need for the reform in the disability sector, because we need to ensure the protection of the rights and dignity of people with disabilities. And that goes without saying, but there is something that I need to get off my chest. I really do. Look, when I bring cases to you guys, I want to make sure that I deep dive, and I have a certain reliance where I want to find information such as pictures and court reports, and I want to get some pictures of family members as well. So I go online and I look in the papers and I try to find the reports that are talking about this case. And I have to say, when you think about the suffering that this poor young woman endured, you would imagine it would be front page news. Guys, I am telling you, this was really hard to gather the information for, because you know what? It really didn't get that much spotlight attention. You know, it wasn't reported on in a way that personally I believe it should have been. This was one of the most vulnerable kinds of young people in our communities. And she was starved to death and left in a tortured state, abandoned by the very people who were meant to care for her. And it just didn't really get any press time. Again, that troubles me, because is it that the press don't feel that we're that interested in reading about people who are disabled who die? And what does that say about what people believe individuals who are not typical are worth? And like I said, I'm highlighting that because it left me with a very unsavoury taste in my mouth. Because if this had been a attractive young woman or attractive young man who was bright and everybody kind of felt they were popular, and this happened to them, it would be everywhere. And I think that that is something that we all need to really take stock of, because until we highlight that every single human life has intrinsic meaning and worth, then we are doing a disservice to people like Debbie. So we always, I know when we discuss these cases and we get involved in the chat about this, do a really important thing, which is that we give legacy to these individuals. And I want us all to remember Debbie. I want us to remember and give visibility to this young woman who once thrived, had a boyfriend, went to college and had the whole life ahead of her. To make sure that we carry those kind of images with us, and we make sure that society in general takes these kind of cases seriously. Thanks for joining me. I really appreciate it. As ever, as I said, if you haven't joined me for a live chat, please do. If you want to listen to a podcast on Patreon, head over there. If you want to get in touch with me on the membership, you can. There's going to be a Discord, as I've said, loads of little perks, and also live chat and live streams where I'm going to have natters with you. Thanks for sharing this space with me. I appreciate all of you as ever. See you again next time with True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. Take care.